So Russia then, today marking the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in World War II, as relations with the West spiral deeper into crisis over the advance of Russian troops against Ukraine. We're going to keep on following those images coming into us live at the moment from Moscow. This parade began around about an hour ago now. It's set to continue for at least another hour or so as well. Vladimir Putin, who rose to power just 8 years after the Soviet Union broke up, he's spoken at that ceremony that's going on there. He said, our forces are always combat ready and Russia will do everything to avoid global confrontation. There will be slightly less military hardware on display there in parades before Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Putin continuing to case the war as part of a holy struggle with the West, which he says has forgotten the role played by the Soviet Union in defeating Nazi Germany. We're going to cross now to talk to our former Moscow correspondent, Nick Holdsworth, who joins us now. Nick, a big day for Russia and for Vladimir Putin. He's already been making that speech there with this parade, isn't it?
Yeah, this is always a big day in Russia. The celebrations to mark victory over the Nazis in May 1945 have been taking place now every year since 1995. After the Second World War, there were just occasional parades, but Yeltsin brought this parade back in 95, and it's been an annual event ever since. This is the one unifying myth that the Kremlin still has to hold on to, the great sacrifice, more than 20 million dead in the Great Patriotic War, as the Russians called the Second World War. And this event has become even more important as part of the propaganda offensive by Putin since he launched the war on Ukraine a couple of years ago. And as you've just mentioned, there may have been less modern military hardware there on Red Square today. I was looking at the live TV pictures from Moscow, and it showed certainly some very high-level technical equipment, rocket carriers, electronic warfare machines, huge trucks, troop carriers, etc., had the traditional wartime, Second World War time tanks, the T-34, leading that part of the parade, and about 9,000 troops involved, including elite paratrooper units and others. That's continuing with Putin paying his respects at the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, where an eternal flame burns just below Red Square, below the Kremlin walls. And this is really part of the Kremlin's effort to show the Russian people that it's still in the game, that it's still a mighty nation, and that it's something to be reckoned with for the West. And he did say, there are a couple of messages here. There's the message to the domestic audience, which is we are strong, and there's the message to the international audience, is that we're strong enough to fend you off. We don't want war, but we're ready for it if it comes to that. And he also added, and this is an olive branch both to the West in a way and to the domestic audience, that Russia's never denigrated the contribution of the Allies in the Second World War. So there are mixed messages there. On the one hand saying we're standing firm, and on the other hand saying we're still ready to talk.
Nick, you mentioned the Russian people there. How important do you think it is for the Russian people to see this going ahead amid the ongoing war in Ukraine?
Given that Putin's official popularity ratings are something around 80%, this is very important for the Russian people. This is a big family holiday. And although it may have been snowing lightly on Red Square just 30 or 40 minutes ago, it is a day normally when the sun shines and people come out in force, and there are parties in the street, there are reenactments with military reenactors wearing their old uniforms, that sort of thing. And it's something which the Russian people really rally around, because with that sacrifice in the Second World War, every single Russian family today has a grandparent, a great uncle, a great aunt who served during the war, who died during the war. So this is something which is very, very central to Russian culture, and the continuation of these parades during this war against Ukraine is part of the regime's package, showing the Russian people that it's still firmly in control.
Nick, thanks very much. Nick Holdsworth, our former Moscow correspondent, talking to us as we continued to see those images coming out of Red Square. So as I said then, coming all of this as Russia seeks to defeat Ukraine, of course. We're going to talk a lot more about that now with our chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons. Rob, Russia does seem, doesn't it, more confident now in Ukraine than it was certainly a year ago. What are its objectives, do you think, at this stage?
Yeah, I think it is more confident than it was a year ago. It went through a period, the end of 2022, the beginning of 2023, when things looked pretty bad. It's stabilised since then, and I think the regime, the Kremlin, is trying to convey the impression that the army is getting on top of things, that the situation for Ukraine is getting worse, and that within a couple of years, 2026 seems to be the target that the Kremlin is looking for. They will get on top of Ukraine and impose its conditions on Ukraine. And those conditions, assuming that the Russian army were to win a victory over the Ukrainian armed forces, would include keeping all the territory that Russia has gained so far, plus more, obviously, in the intervening years. That it would also include the cities of Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, and Odessa, the largest port on the Black Sea coast. That would forbid Ukraine from ever joining NATO and allow Russia to effectively appoint whoever would become head of state in Ukraine. That's the sort of relationship with Ukraine that Russia is looking forward to in the future, and it hopes to achieve that by using the tactics we're seeing at the moment, a tactics essentially of attrition along that very long 1,000-kilometre front. Grinding away at the Ukrainian armed forces, exhausting them both in terms of manpower and in terms of equipment and ammunition, and at the same time undermining the confidence of Ukrainians' allies in their ability to carry on supplying Ukraine. That, however, is not going as well as the Russians, I think, had thought it was going to go, with the decision by Congress to give aid of $61 billion to the military effort in Ukraine and the efforts too of the European Union. So although Russia is trying to convey this impression of confidence, it may be a rather brittle sort of confidence.
Yeah, what about the state, would you say then, Rob, of the state of the Russian armed forces? I mean, it's one of the biggest armies in the world, let's not forget that, of course. But has its performance got better or worse since the start of the war?
I think it's got better. I think there's very much doubt about that. At the beginning of the war, it was big. They managed to put about 370,000 troops into Ukraine, but it was not very well coordinated, not very well led. Now the organisation of the armed forces is much better. They seem to have clearly stated, established goals by what they want to achieve. Those private armies that appeared for a while seem to have disappeared. The goals are clear, but the problem, I think, is that although the armed forces now are bigger, they have over 500,000 men in Ukraine now. Many of those soldiers are very inexperienced because they're being put through sort of meat grinder tactics in the Ukraine. The casualties they're suffering are colossal. The soldiers who are dying are being replaced by soldiers who have little experience. That said, the war economy has been building up quite fast in Russia. According to some reports, as much as 30% of spending last year went on defence. They're able to, so they say, produce 1,500 tanks a year, 30,000 armoured vehicles. They can produce 1.3 million 152 millimetre shells a year. It all sounds very impressive, but if you look more closely at it, there are pitfalls there as well. If you look, for instance, at the tanks, 80% of those tanks that are being produced are refurbished old tanks, some of them dating back to the 1950s. 1.3 million shells of that caliber sounds like quite a lot until you start comparing it with the sort of numbers they need if they're to achieve the sort of aims they've set themselves of defeating Ukraine by 2022. They would need probably somewhere in the region of 4 million a year. They can get some of those from imports from North Korea, from Syria, from Iran and so on, but not enough, and they're having to fall back on their stocks, and the stocks are running out.
I'm going to ask you finally, Rob, that question that I know people like you hate being asked, because it's a bit of a crystal ball question, isn't it? But given everything you've said, what do you think we might see on the battlefield in Ukraine over the next few months and over the next year?
I think the likelihood is more of the same. It's going to be grinding. A lot has been made of the fact that Russia, over the last 6 months or so, has inched its way forward. It's true. Russia has taken somewhere in the region of 400 square kilometres of territory. That's about, for those who know it, the size of the Isle of Wight in the English Channel. Now, it's a relatively small island. It's not a lot of territory. And this is a period in which Russia has had quite marked advantages in terms of manpower and artillery. That is being balanced out now as more equipment starts to come into Ukraine. It's taking a little while to get there, but it's beginning to come in. By the summer, it's expected that there'll be more of a balance. And since if you're an attacking force, you need a preponderance of about 3-1 by most military estimates. Russia is a long way off that. The Ukrainians give the impression that if it comes to a war of attrition, Russia cannot really advance very much further. The question is, in their minds, can they acquire over the next 2 years sufficient technological advantage over the Russians to push them back?
We shall see. Rob, thanks very much. Rob Parsons, our chief foreign editor here on France 24.